Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today.
Hi, JD.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful.
Good.
I'm
Yeah,
I'm
today
up
we
in New
have.
England. I'm looking at the forecast. We've got snowflakes coming, which is always fun.
Oh, good. I'm with JD Barker today. He is a thriller and horror author, right?
Yeah, I bounce back and forth, much to the detriment of my agents and editors and publishers that that they all want it. The first thing they do when you turn in a book is they want to put you in a box, so that they know how to sell you. And I refuse to write that same book over and over again, which kind of frustrates a lot of them. But the readers love it.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I was just talking to another author this morning. I write in multiple genres. She's like, "How do you do all this?" Because I'm like, if I have to kill someone, the next book, the worst thing I want to happen is that maybe somebody dumps them, right?
Well, it's one of those things. I've got so many friends in this industry. I was working behind the scenes for about 20 years as a book doctor and ghostwriter. So I got to know a lot of people that were in this industry. And, like they would get horribly frustrated when they got, like, they would have a big bestseller. And then all of a sudden they had to write five more that were basically the same but different, which gets really old. But you get trapped in that, because all of a sudden that's paying your bills. So, like, you have to write that same, police procedural or whatever over and over again. And I didn't want to fall into that. I reached out to Dean Koontz, who I've known for years, and told him that from the get-go. And he said, well, if you don't want to do that, here's what you do. First of all, he helped craft the text on my Wikipedia page, which was really important because it says I'm a suspense author who may include elements of sci-fi, horror, this or that. But it basically sets the tone for anybody that writes about me or interviews me. I'm a suspense author that may have horror, may have this, may have that. And then the books, I bounced back and forth. So my first one was a horror novel, then I did a thriller, then I did another horror, and back to thriller. And I found that it's almost like being a literary Pied Piper. Like I write, one particular genre, then I go into something that's, kind of genre adjacent, and I grab this giant new, reader base from this new group of people and bring them into the fold. So I've tried to capitalize on that.
Well, that's awesome. What is your most recent release?
I write books with James Patterson, and he's kind of taught me his business model, which means I've got a ridiculous number of books coming out between myself and co-authors. The last one I had come out on my own, it was called Heavier the Stones, which I wrote with a friend of mine who's a neuropsychologist. And again, like working with other people, like I find that like she was able to bring that authentic voice to the book. Like I can fake my way through being a neuropsychologist in a book. I can do Google searches. I can watch enough documentaries, to get the text right and the dialogue right. But having that authentic voice in there as part of the writing process is priceless. So I've been writing a lot of co-author titles and bringing people in based on their expertise.
Fun. Okay, so I'm a huge vampire lover, and I noticed that you wrote one with Dracul Stoker. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I hung out with the guy for 3 days before I even said his name out loud because I wasn't sure how to say it. So it's Dacre. So
Baker.
I remember it because of the word acre, as far as land. So
Okay.
Dacre. He's Dacre Stoker. He's Bram's great grandnephew. I got really lucky with that. So my very first book, it was called Forsaken. It was a horror novel, and it got nominated for the best horror novel the year that it came out, or best debut. And I was at the Stoker Awards, named after Bram Stoker, sitting next to Dacre Stoker at a book signing, and we got to talking, and I picked his brain on everything related to Bram Stoker because I figured, when am I going to get this opportunity again? And he asked me about my history working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, and projects that I had done with other people. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a job interview. He pulled me aside the next day and said, "Listen, the Stoker family read your book. We love your writing style, and we've been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a while now, using all of Bram's original notes and journals. Is that something you'd be
Wow.
interested in doing?" I wasn't going to say no to that. And
Yeah.
that was a fun, crazy project to work on.
Yeah, I can't imagine anybody saying, I mean, even if you're not a vampire lover, like, and I don't know if you just saw the new release Nosferatu that came out, but I thought they did a good job on that. And yeah, I'm definitely one clicking on Dracul and getting that as my next read.
The weirdest part about that book, the way Dacre sold me on it, I've known Dracula, the story, like my entire life. It was the first, what I consider to be an adult book that I read as a kid. I was 8 years old. I found it at a yard sale. I didn't think my mom would let me buy it, but it was 25 cents. And she said, okay, go ahead and get it. Scared the pants off of me. Like I slept with the lights on for like a week after that. But when Dacre pulled me aside and told me about this project, he told me that the book as we know it isn't really the book that we know. Like it starts with Jonathan Harker on a train, which is actually page 120 of the original manuscript.
Oh, wow.
When Bram first turned it in, he fully believed vampires were real, to the point where he had himself cremated when he died to protect his immortal soul. That was what we had in his journal. But he turned the book into his editor, and the editor pushed it back across the desk and said, "We can't publish this. It's going to scare people too much." And at that time in history, Jack the Ripper was active in London. People believed in the paranormal, so they weren't willing to do it. So Bram needed the money. They forced him to strip out those first 120 pages, and publish the book. Which to me was a fascinating thing. And then ultimately, as part of the process, Dacre and I, we got to see the original Dracula manuscript. It was found in a barn in Pennsylvania, of all places, and nobody knows how it got there. But it was purchased by Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft. So he flew us out to Seattle. They locked us in a conference room, took away our phones, made us wear gloves, and a bunch of very large men stood in the corner and watched us as we flipped through this manuscript. We opened it up hoping that the first 100, some pages would be there, but they weren't. It starts at page 120. It's crossed off with a number one next to it. Bram wrote Dracula up at the top. But what we ended up finding is, in today's world, you write a book, if you delete something, you literally hit the delete key, it's gone forever. In Bram's world, he wrote that book on a typewriter. So if he wanted to delete something, he drew a line through it. So we started flipping through the manuscript, looking at those deleted scenes, and we found that they referenced the first 100 some pages of the book. So we were able to piece together what his original story was, and go from there. And that's what Dracul is. But the best part of Dracul, like you'll read that book, and when you get to the end, when you read the author's note, we tell you how much of it was actually real, and that's the part that's going to get you.
Okay, well, I will look forward to that and make sure that I have a nightlight by my bed. Well, tell me, so one book stood out to me, Something I Keep Upstairs. Tell me about that book.
So that's my next one. It comes out in May. This is one of those books. It took me about 4 years to write. I kept freaking myself out, and I had to put it aside. And then I would write a thriller or something, and then I'd come back to it. But it took me about 4 years to get this from start to finish. I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth, up in New Hampshire, and I go for a run every day. And when I cross the beach, there's a tiny little house on an island all by itself off our coast, and it's just far enough away. It's probably about a quarter mile where you can see the house, but you can't really tell what's going on out there. Every once in a while you'll see a light on, maybe somebody walking on the beach, but you don't really know what's happening. And, as an author, like I've got this thing called a what if gene. So like immediately when I see something weird like that, it's like, what if this is happening? What if that's happening? So the pieces of this story started coming together in my head. And I ultimately created something I keep upstairs. It's about a 17-year-old kid who inherits that house. His grandmother owned it. She passes away and she leaves it to him. So imagine 17 years old, you're given a house on an island, all by itself. He does what any other 17-year-old would do. They turn it into a party house. So him and his buddies, they all go out there on boats, and they're drinking and having a good time. But the novelty of that wears off fairly quickly. One night they're sitting around and they start to talk about haunted houses, and the conversation shifts. What could we do to turn this into a haunted house? So they start discussing that, and they start with exactly where you would expect, Ouija boards and things like that. But the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you know where they're going. And it's the journey that's fun. But the book it scared the bejesus out of me as I was writing it. It came out really, really well. And we're having a lot of fun with it, because the house itself it's been there for a very long time. It's about 400 years old. Many people have said that it's haunted, and it's got a lot of like local legends behind it. As part of our promotion for this book, we're actually giving away an overnight stay in the house for one person and three of their friends. So whoever wins this thing, they're going to put them on a boat, take them out to the house, drop them off on the island, and nobody's coming back for 24 hours. So they're going to get left alone in this haunted house on a tiny little island. So everything about this, we're having a ball, but it comes out in May.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It's like spending a night at the Stanley Hotel in that room, right?
Yeah, my wife and I actually did stay at the Stanley. I wrote I've got a book called The Fourth Monkey, and I wrote the final cliffhanger scene in the same room that Stephen King wrote the parts of The Shining, or came up with it when he was staying there. That's a fun hotel. It's well, you're in Colorado, so it's not
Right.
that far for you. For me, it's across the country, and like a 3 hour drive from the airport. Like Estes Park is this tiny little place where it is, but it's a beautiful hotel, and if you love anything like that, or you just want to get away, like I recommend that place all the time.
Yeah, every time we have guests come, because I'm only 45 minutes from there. So every time we have
Oh.
guests come, we always take them there because that's our favorite tour. So I did stay there overnight, well, not in that room, obviously, but I did stay there overnight. And I didn't sleep all that night, but
Well, you know what killed me is they renovated that room. So like you expect to
oh,
go in there and find, like an old clawfoot tub and all this stuff. And like there's a clawfoot tub there, but it's from Home Depot like 2 years ago.
oh, that's
So
too
it kind of lost that vibe. But there's plenty of freaky places in that hotel. I was out there a few years ago with a guy named Josh Mallerman, who's a fantastic horror author. Jack Ketchum was there, who's another guy. We were actually down in the basement reading scary stories to each other at midnight. So a lot of fun.
fun. So you have this, what, and it sounds like you love the thriller and the horror just as much. Do you have a favorite book or a favorite character?
That's like asking who your favorite kid is. And for me, it always tends to be the last book that I wrote. So something I keep upstairs is it's probably the one I'm most proud of. Because I feel like it hits on it just ticks off every box. And the fact that it's just based on a real place, I think that's going to add another whole element to it. But it's funny because I travel the world at this point, doing book tours and stuff like that. And no matter where I go, there's one book that people like the fans actually put in front of me every time and say this is my favorite. It's a book called She Has Something or She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be. It's like the longest title in the world. The book is almost 1,000 pages. Like my agent didn't want it, my publisher didn't want it, but it's consistently sold very well. And again, like it is the fan favorite everywhere I go. So like, I was just in Budapest. I had about 1,000 people that came to a book signing, and probably 100 of them had a copy of that book in their hand and told me that. So as a fan favorite, that's the one for sure.
Okay, so that's where we should start if we're breaking into your world, other than the Dracula
Yeah.
or
Yeah, I
Dracul.
mean, it all depends on what you're looking for. If you like vampires, I've got Dracul. If you like serial killers, start with the 4MK series. If you want something scary, something I keep upstairs. If you're just looking for an inspirational type story, She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be. That particular book. It's basically my retelling of Great Expectations, but with a suspenseful horror type twist to it.
Interesting. That's a very cool concept. How did you get your start in this business? Were you an English major or well, you read Dracula at age 8, so I'm guessing you were a reader from the very beginning.
Yes, I grew up without a TV in the house, which, I was born in 71, so that's not saying a whole lot. Like there were three channels on at the time. There was nothing worth watching anyway. But we used to go hit the library pretty much all the time. And I was reading by the time I was 3. And by the time I got into kindergarten, I'd read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and moved on to like Charles Dickens and stuff like that. I always liked to write. I've got a sister who's about a year younger than me. I used to write stories and staple them together. And I created a little library in my room, and she would check out the stories and I would charge her late fees. So like this has been going on basically forever. And my parents encouraged the creative side of it, but they also added the caveat that, writing is a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living as an author. You have to get a real job. So that was drilled into my head. So I finished up high school. I went off to college. Ended up getting a degree in finance, another one in IT, and ended up working in the corporate world. But during that time, I continued to write. I used to work as for a lot of newspapers and magazines, interviewing celebrities. And that's essentially where I'd gotten my start. And that evolved into a side hustle as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, which I would basically do at night. So I'd work the corporate gig during the daytime, 60 to 80 hours a week. And then just to, unwind, I would write and work on, other people's books, helping them fine tune them and get them ready for publication. I did that for a little over 2 decades, which was fun. But at the same time, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I had written with other people, but they all came out with somebody else's name on the cover, which gets very old after a while. So, the sixth one hit up, my wife pulled me aside and she said, listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's find a way to make this happen. And we were kind of trapped at that point because I had, a strong corporate job. I was making about $250,000 a year. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat. We couldn't just walk away from that. It was just too expensive. So ultimately we decided to sell everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and we lived in the other side, and basically got to the point where I could live off the savings long enough to write that first book, and quit the day job.
Well, very cool. And I'm guessing, I mean, people knew you could write because you'd done these ghostwriting. Did somebody give you a contract right for your first book? I mean, you pitched it and they gave you a contract for your first book or your first solo book?
I wish it would have worked out that way. So I knew I could write a solid book, and the first book was called Forsaken. It's about the witches in Salem, and I knew the book was good. Stephen King actually let me use some of his characters from Needful Things in it, which was another like a huge endorsement at the time. So I figured I would have no trouble getting an agent or a publisher. But when I queried agents, I didn't follow the process at all. I didn't do what you're supposed to do. I bought a list of agents. I think there were 200 on an Excel spreadsheet. I emailed them all the exact same thing, literally to whom it may concern. This is what my book is about. Here's the first 3 chapters, expecting to get this flood of agents wanting it. What I later learned is, every agent's got their own set of specs of what they want. So if you go to their website, they'll tell you, I want the first chapter, or I want a Word document. I want a PDF. It needs to be an Arial font. It needs to be Times New Roman. They all tell you what they want. And if you don't do exactly what they want, they don't even bother to read it. So I got very little response on that. I ended up indie publishing the book. But I did it. My thinking was, if I were going to indie publish, I needed to do something on par with what I saw coming out of Random House. So I put it out as a hardcover, a paperback, an audio book. I hired professionals across the board for covers, for formatting, for editing, and released it that way. And ultimately, I got really lucky. Publishers Weekly heard about me getting Stephen King's permission to use some of his stuff in the book. They wrote a story about me trying to get his permission and how that all worked out. And when that story hit up, librarians read it, bookstore owners read about it, and that kind of lit the fire on that book, and ultimately ended up selling a lot of copies. The second time around, when I wrote The Fourth Monkey, I fully intended to self-publish that one because I'd done so well with the first one. But my wife convinced me to query a couple of agents, and I queried, I believe it was 53 of them, and I got 13 offers within 2 weeks. So it was the exact opposite of what happened the first time. But at that point, I had a track record. They could look me up, they could see those sales numbers, and it's a lot easier to sell a book to a publisher when you can back it up with stuff like that.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely did the whole Excel sheet thing. But I did look at their website to see what they wanted. So I at least had that down. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. You have the Excel sheet, just like of 300 on my list.
I think back then we were probably all working off the same Excel spreadsheet. We probably all bought it over and over again from different people.
Super fun. So what has been your best experience as being an author?
I've had so many instances of what I call capturing lightning in a bottle, so like Stephen King let me use some of his stuff for my first book. Like, when does that happen? Then the Stoker family called me up and asked me to write that prequel to Dracula. So like, that was the second time it happened. When my publisher was shopping, or sending out Fourth Monkey, right before it was supposed to come out, they sent ARC copies out to like big name authors, hoping to get that little quote on the back of the book. James Patterson got a copy of it. He read it, and then he ultimately reached out to me, and we ended up writing together. We've done 5 books together. So like, that was another time when something like that happened. For whatever reason, it keeps happening to me over and over again. I always tell people not to stand next to me outside, like, because I'm worried that like lightning is going to strike, for karma and like even things out, and you don't want to be right next to me when it happens. I think in a lot of ways, I manufacture a lot of this stuff too. I'm always looking for, like high profile projects. I've got a number of books that have been optioned at this point by the folks in Hollywood, and Dracul is one of them. At one point, a guy named Peter Filardi was working on it, and Peter Filardi wrote, I don't know if you remember a movie called Flatliners back in the 90s, but he wrote that, and it's one of my all-time favorite movies. If you haven't seen it, you definitely check it out. It's got Julia Roberts, Kevin Bacon, Kiefer Sutherland, Billy Baldwin, like this huge cast, back when nobody knew who they were. It's a fantastic movie, but he wrote it. I called him up and I told him, listen, I've got an idea to kind of reboot this if you want to write something. And at the time, the studio still had those rights, so he couldn't do anything with it. But this past January, he called me up and said, hey, I just got the rights back. Do you still want to do something? So like, out of the blue, this came together. So as soon as word of that got out, all the studios were jumping all over us before we even wrote the first word of the book. And that's what I'm working on now. I'm almost done with the first draft. We're hoping to get that done in the next couple of months. So it's most likely going to come out as a novel first and then a feature film later. But I try to offset my own personal stuff with some type of high profile project at any given moment, which helps generate a lot of press and kind of keeps my name in front of people because, at the end of the day, this is a business. I need to market myself. I need to market the books. We're selling a product. So I always try to keep that in mind with everything I do.
Well, fun. Well, I would say probably the reason why people are coming to you and asking you to write books and do the projects is because you're really good at what you do. I would put that at the top of your list.
Maybe. I appreciate it.
Okay, so my favorite question to ask authors, and you have a big blanket, obviously, but what if there's one thing that you want people to take away from, you can pick a book or you can just say in general, what do you want readers to take away or experience when they read one of your books?
One of the reasons I liked books when I was a kid is it allowed me to get lost. Like I could pick up a book and open the cover and get lost in some world that, somebody created characters, that people made up, but literally forget about what was happening in my real life. And that's kind of my goal with every book. I don't try to send like a moral message. I don't want to teach anybody anything. I write what I call popcorn fiction. Like it's, like you eat one piece, you got to just keep going and going and going. That's kind of how I want the reading process to be. And when people close that cover, I want them to feel like they just, had some entertainment. They just enjoyed something. And that's my ultimate goal.
Fun. Well, thank you so much for being here, JD Barker. Where can we find you and your books?
The easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. The books can be found in bookstores everywhere. I've got 3 coming out over the next couple of months. We've got We Don't Talk About Emma coming out in February, The Writer coming out with James Patterson in March, and then Something I Keep Upstairs out in May.
Well, congratulations and thank you for being here again. And we will see you next time you release a book. And it seems like it will be like maybe 6 months from now.
Probably. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Take
Bye.
care.